A very good morning to you all and welcome to Reform UK's press conference to talk about the incredibly serious energy crisis that we face and our emergency response to that. Because we've got two crises that we've got to solve. We've got to solve the price crisis, but we've also got to solve the supply crisis. And if we look at where we're at, the reality is that we are in a global energy war. And this could continue for many years. This is the gravest crisis in our living memory. It's probably the gravest crisis since the Second World War. And the centre of that crisis is, of course, in Western Europe, but it's a global energy war where many nations, we're in a sort of desperate scrabble for energy in the same way that we were desperately scrabbling for PPE at the beginning of COVID. And unfortunately, the UK energy market has failed. It is no longer fit for purpose. After a decade of failure, of poor leadership, and civil servants and others, this is what we've been led to. But the Reform UK solution can prevent a serious national crisis. We can stop thousands of elderly and vulnerable people dying years early this winter of cold and hunger. We can stop millions defaulting on their energy bills. We can protect consumers. We can stop 100,000 plus small and medium-sized businesses from going bust, which in itself would lead to over 500,000 jobs being lost this winter. And with this plan, it would significantly reduce inflation, and that in itself would then reduce the pressure on the Bank of England to raise interest rates too far. And this plan would solve the supply crisis, which is also incredibly serious. And until we solve that, we have to be prepared to accept this situation may not go away. Now, essentially, we're in a situation called force majeure. This is a warlike situation, and what the government must do is it must declare that force majeure exists in the UK energy market, which has failed. And when you're in a war, and this is an energy war, then the government has to take control of the pricing of energy production. That's the essence of our proposal. But first of all, we need to look at the causes of this crisis of supply and price. We need to plan for the worst. That's the responsible thing to do. Of course, let's prepare for better. But we have to plan for the worst and for quite a long time. And this crisis of supply leads to a serious risk of rationing of gas and electricity this winter. Unbelievable that we should be saying that in 2022. There is no real prospect of any increase in supply in at least the next 3 years. And we should assume, again, planning for the worst, that there's no Russian gas available to Europe. Even if the Ukraine war ends today, why on earth do you think that Putin would reopen the gas taps? He will be seeing, and I'm afraid to say, he will be enjoying the pain that Western Europe is experiencing. So we have to assume he won't reopen the taps, even if people wanted to buy gas from him. Also, finally, there's no headroom whatsoever for breakdowns or for a severe, cold, windless winter. So that's the crisis of supply. And then let's look at the crisis of price. There's a serious risk. Millions and millions of households will simply be unable to pay their bills. They will go into arrears. They'll have to default on their gas and electricity bills. I mean, the growth in prices being forecast is horrific. We're going to hear tomorrow what is the proposed domestic cap from October 2022. It's going to be over £3,500. That's about, it's an increase of 300%, give or take, from where it was just 12 months ago. But that's not it, is it? Because from January next year, just a few months away, they're talking of well over £4,000. April next year, the figures are into orbit. Is it over £5,000? Is it over £6,000? No one knows, but it's horrific. If you look at the price of markets, the wholesale global gas markets, they're going through the roof. The price of coal is going through the roof. No one knows where this ends. It's completely naive and foolish to think that this is the peak. It may not be. It's wrong to think that prices will go back down anytime soon. This is not temporary while this supply crisis continues. We could be scrabbling for energy for years and years. So this situation is urgent, and the current situation is totally unsustainable. We need immediate, robust action to deal with the pricing, to come up with a price solution. Our plan does that. And we need a credible, medium-term supply plan. So the cause of the supply crisis is strategic errors over many years by politicians and civil servants. I'm afraid to say some of which, frankly, border on gross negligence. We've increased our reliance on imported electricity, up about 400% in the last decade or so. We've increased our reliance on imported gas, up 25% since 2014, much of which comes in these specialist liquefied natural gas ships. But of course, there's only a limited supply of these ships, and there's only a limited number of terminals. The gas production in the UK has reduced over 40% in the last decade. We're sitting on our own gas. It's like a treasure trove. But foolishly, we've reduced production by over 40%. Our generating capacity of fossil fuel and nuclear energy has gone down in the last decade or so by over 30%. Power stations have closed with no replacements. I'm sorry, it's uncomfortable to say it, but this is the result of gross negligence. Nothing less than that. Now, we shouldn't underestimate, of course, the risk of mechanical failure. Historically, in winter, recently, year after year, we've been buying some electricity from France, but they've now got major maintenance problems of their own with their own nuclear power stations. So they're not going to be able to sell us electricity this year. In fact, they're going to be trying to buy electricity from us that we haven't got to sell them. So we could have that really difficult decision. Do we do the thing where we've essentially been buying from them and therefore morally we should sell to them? But what if we haven't got enough for ourselves? You see the problem. Likewise, there's a serious risk that Norway will be unable to sell us electricity due to their own problems, their own challenges, their own shortages. And of course, that's before the risk of any breakdown in our own generating capacity. And I'm afraid to say, there's a thing that we all know well. It's called Sod's Law, and it will always come to bite us at the worst possible moment. And this is all so totally unnecessary. We've got vast resources of energy treasure in the UK, under our feet, under our own seas. It's owned by us all. But our politicians and our civil servants, in their foolish negligence, they have chosen not to use it. North Sea oil and gas, onshore shale gas, even coal, for heaven's sake. We've got no backup capacity. We could have been self-reliant like we were for about 25 years after 1980. We could have been barely exposed to this global crisis. That is the price of failure by our politicians. And it's us, the consumer, British citizens, that are now having to pay that price. Now, we can correct all of this, but it's going to take determination, leadership, and it's going to take between 5 and 10 years. This chart here shows the global constraint on gas supply. It's not as easy to move gas around in ships as it is with oil. So this shows the green is the quantity of liquefied natural gas, excluding Russia. The blue segment is the liquefied natural gas that is moved by Russia. But if you take that segment out of the equation, you can see that we're about here in the middle here, there's a gap between the green and the red line. The red line represents demand, the green represents supply excluding Russia. And so you can see that gap growing, even with increase in construction, which is represented by the purple, over the coming years. There's a huge gap that's growing out until 27, 28, 29. This is why it's wrong to think that this is a temporary crisis and this will sort itself out. There is a huge gap here, and that is potentially really, really worrying. It's almost terrifying what that may do. So if we now look at what's the cause of the price crisis, well, the truth is, and it's an uncomfortable truth, way before Ukraine, we had expensive electricity here in the UK because we've been growing our renewable generating capacity since 2004. But the renewables, with their inflation-linked subsidies, is the main cause that electricity has increased in price by 9% per annum for the last 17 years. So the renewables are being subsidised to the tune of some £10 billion a year. And then the cost of connecting those renewables to the grid, that operating cost, the network transmission costs, that's another £5 billion. £15 billion is the extra cost of the renewables. That's why you can see in this graph, as the percentage of capacity of renewables has grown from 0 to about 25% in the last 17 years, the price of electricity has relentlessly grown by 9% a year compound over that period, whilst the price of gas has barely moved until the end of 2021, when obviously with the Ukraine war, it shifted. So all of those who say to you that renewables are cheaper and we need more renewables, I'm sorry, but they're either deeply misinformed or they are deliberately misleading you. It is simply not true. The electricity price in the last 17 years has grown relentlessly because of the cost of the subsidies of the renewable generation. Now, what's the Tory government's solution? Well, at the moment, of course, essentially there's a complete vacuum of anything going on in Westminster, but they've got no short-term plan. They've got some reactive, almost sort of begrudging domestic handouts, no help for business. And any of these plans, they're talking about months, not years. But as I said earlier, we have to prepare that this goes on for years. They've been way too slow. There seems to be no recognition of the genuine fear and terror amongst the population. And they've got no credible medium-term supply plan. I don't think they understand the strategic nature of the supply problem. And look, you've got Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. They're saying in these hustings around the country that they support the shale gas industry subject to local consent. We know what that means. We know that that means that the eco-zealots, the anti-shale gas lobby, much of whom, by the way, it turns out was funded indirectly from President Putin so that he could sell more of his own gas, they will stop that if you rely on local consents. So we have to deal with that. There's not enough recognition that we've got to use our own resources. Now, the Labour Party and the Lib Dems, well, look, they've come up with some well-intentioned ideas, but frankly, it's just woefully short-sighted. They're relying on, again, on domestic handouts, no help for business whatsoever. If businesses can't survive, hundreds of thousands of jobs will go. Their solutions cover, again, months, not years. There's no long-term thinking or planning, or even medium-term thinking. There's no recognition by either Labour or the Liberal Democrats about the supply crisis. So they're proposing to freeze the cap at £2,000. But we already know the cap is going to £4,000 or more. At £4,000, the difference, that's a subsidy of 60 billion quid with no help for business. If the cap is if the actual price goes up to £5,000, that's 90 billion a year. And I'm fearing this is going on for 3 to 5 years. So they're talking about a subsidy of £250 billion to £500 billion. That's £500 billion. They're talking about a potential subsidy way more than the cost of COVID. you see the problem. They're not planning for the medium term. So businesses will either go bust because they're not being offered any help by any of the mainstream parties with their solutions, or businesses will have to raise prices. And if you raise prices, yes, you get more inflation. There's no medium-term supply plan by the Liberal Democrats or the Labour Party. They simply don't understand the strategic nature of it. They don't understand why we had expensive electricity beforehand. And if they think that more renewables are the answer, I'm afraid to say this problem gets worse and worse and worse. And you can't keep growing the windfall taxes, because if you grow up the windfall taxes, eventually the companies will be making no net profit whatsoever, at which point they'll just stop. But our solution is bold, it's radical. We have to declare there's a force majeure situation. A wartime situation requires a wartime response from government. The energy market is simply no longer fit for purpose. It has failed. And as someone who believes in free markets, that's a difficult thing to accept. But that is the reality. In an energy wartime-like situation, there's no choice but for the government to take control of the pricing of UK energy production. That means, by law, that needs to be passed in September on an urgent basis, rather like the Coronavirus Act, all UK energy producers in UK territories will be obliged to sell to government-approved UK suppliers at the average price they received for the energy they generated in 2021. Now, if they refuse or if they reduce supply, then the sanction is clear. They will be nationalised. So we're not saying nationalise them at the moment. We're saying that we've got to have the government will fix the price, because that's what happens in war. In the Second World War, the UK government fixed the price of production of many, many things, which represented cost plus a bit of profit. That's where we're at now. That is the required solution. That will enable the domestic cap to be returned, we calculate, to about £1,750 per year. It'll enable a cap on the business cost of energy at around about 35 pence per kilowatt hour. That's high. It's over double what people were paying just over a year ago, but it's a lot better than the 50, 60 or 70 pence per kilowatt hour that people are being quoted at the moment. Now, there will still be needed some extra help for the most vulnerable, the elderly, pensioners. Carefully targeted. But this is the basis of the scheme. This is durable. It can last as long as this situation lasts. I don't know if it's 3 years, 4 years or 5 years. I genuinely, absolutely do not believe that it's 6 months. So it has to exist until normal market conditions return. Now, we will still be exposed for about 20% of our energy production, that varies a little bit year to year, to global gas prices, and that's why you end up with the cap being higher than it was a year ago. But this bold and radical solution must also extend to the supply side. If you get more supply, then prices are lower. This requires, for all our energy, it requires a national planning with local compensation regime in order to accelerate new gas and more nuclear supplies. We've got to unlock our shale gas treasure. Many estimates say there's about £1 trillion worth of the value of the shale gas in the rock today. Imagine £1 trillion of levelling up by drilling down. When I campaign, people on the doorsteps want shale gas. They know that it can reduce our bills, it can create jobs, it can help levelling up. £1 trillion of levelling up by drilling down. We've got to accelerate gas and oil exploration in the North Sea. We've got to build high efficiency combined cycle gas turbines. They can be done in about 2 years. And yes, we've got to accelerate the latest small modular nuclear reactors. But no, Boris, it's not one a year. The first one wouldn't be ready for about a decade. Do you see the issue? This is going to take some time. And that's fine. If people want to build more renewables, that's great. But no more subsidies. no more subsidies for renewables. But in order to achieve this extra investment, to motivate and encourage those same businesses and producers to invest in these extra supplies, we've got to scrap the windfall tax, because if you take the pricing back to 2021, then those producers, of course, of energy in the UK, they're no longer making windfall profits. So you scrap the windfall tax, you guarantee that scrapped for the duration of this crisis. Now, we've got to get back as a nation to being self-reliant. And the time frame of this is that, yes, improvements could be made after about 3 years. But to resolve this fully, totally, comprehensively, it's going to take about 7 to 10 years, depending on planning and other issues. So it's a medium-term supply crisis, but we've got to get on with dealing it now, and that's why you've got to have a national planning and local compensation regime. So in summary, we are in a global energy war. I know it's an uncomfortable situation. This is difficult language, but we've got to be honest with everybody. We've got to declare that force majeure exists. The UK energy market has failed. It's no longer fit for purpose in this global energy war. And so the government has to take control in a warlike situation of the cost of the pricing of energy production here in the UK. Energy producers have got to be obliged to sell to UK government-approved suppliers, retail suppliers, at the average price they received in 2021. Now, the truth is they were making money, reasonable money, some might say fair money, in 2021. But if any of them reject that, or if they try to reduce the quantity of supply, then they need to know they'll be nationalised. This is a moment when the whole nation has to come together, and that includes the big businesses that are part of our critical national infrastructure. That enables the domestic cap to come back down to about £1,750 a year. It enables a business cap to be put on at around about 35 pence per kilowatt hour. And yes, there still need to be some carefully targeted, vital help for the vulnerable, the elderly, pensioners and those in real need, but it must be more carefully targeted. Now, this situation must exist until market conditions return. I don't know when that is, but I fear it's quite some time. We have to plan for the worst. We have to plan on the basis that Putin decides he's not going to reopen the gas taps to Europe. He's going to sell to China and India and countries like that instead, in which case we've got a permanent, enduring shortage of gas. And you can't rely on the wind, folks, renewables, because what happens when the wind doesn't blow? Do we light up the candles? Electricity doesn't work on the 23 million or so gas boilers in our homes across the country. We need a national planning regime with local compensation in order to solve the supply crisis, but it's going to take 3 to 10 years. We've got to scrap the windfall tax because we've got to motivate the energy producers, the investors, back into investing in more supply. This solution, I know it's uncomfortable. Some people will say it's over-dramatic, but it deals with the worst-case scenario. That is the key point. This will prevent a serious national crisis. It will protect the elderly and the vulnerable. It will protect consumers, it'll protect businesses, it'll protect jobs. It will significantly reduce the rate of inflation and therefore reduce the pressure on the Bank of England to raise interest rates. And this solution will solve the supply crisis over the medium term. And that is absolutely essential. We have to become self-reliant once again. We used to be, but the negligence of our senior politicians failed us. This solution, it's not easy. Of course it's difficult. It requires determination. It requires courage. But that is what leadership is about in a really difficult situation. So the Reform UK solution, we believe, is the right solution. It's lasting, it's enduring for as long as this crisis lasts, and it will deal with this crisis. It'll solve the price crisis, it'll solve the supply crisis. But it requires courage and real leadership. So that concludes the main presentation. We've got in the presentation, we've got some appendices, which is all UK government data, which we'll just flick through. I'm not going to go through these, but there's a series of graphs setting out the quantity of supply, all in 2021. People can look at their leisure, possibly with a cold towel over your head. Some of it's a bit granular and a bit detailed, but showing our energy use, the supply by fuel in 2021, and then moving on, showing the generation by source in 2021. People can look at that and understand the details. This is all government data. Our demand, the consumption in 2021, and the generating capacity, where you can see that gas was the main player. So there's some important information. Have a look at that at your leisure. This shows gas production and consumption in 2021. But in summary, folks, before I take some questions, we really have to have the courage to deal with the situation. The government has to take control of the pricing of energy until this is resolved. So that's my presentation. I hope that's of interest to people, and I am now able to take some questions. I think we've got some appearing on the screen there. Yes, here we are. There's the first question from a member of the public. So, Richard, if this is so serious, why is no one else proposing such a radical plan? I believe it is serious, I really do. And actually, I just think that the mainstream parties, they've not looked at the gravity, they've not thought of the worst case scenario. They've looked at the problem immediately in front of their face. They haven't thought, hang on, what happens if this goes on and on? If you make the assumption that Putin's just going to reopen the gas taps, then you might think this is a short-term problem. I think that is a fatally flawed assumption. Next question just come in here. Well, Richard, why don't we just nationalise the lot? And I know many people on the left will be very tempted to say, crikey, if someone on the right is prepared to look at this sort of solution, then yeah, let's just nationalise the lot. But in reality, governments may be good at funding situations. Governments are very bad at managing businesses. They're very bad at managing risk. And it would be much better to be able to incentivise the producers so that they continue to produce at the same rate. We know that in 2021, the gas producers, the power plants, the wind farms, they were all making reasonable, fair returns. I'm saying that we need to go back to that situation by law until this crisis is over. But if they refuse, then we're left with no other option than to nationalise them. So there's another question here, which is, are you being a bit over-dramatic with the expression a global energy war? And actually, are you scaring people even more? Look, I'm afraid this is a really serious, grave situation. It's the worst I can think of since the Second World War. People are terrified. And I think it's incumbent upon people in positions of leadership, politicians, to tell the truth as they see it. Not to sugarcoat it, not to say that's too scary. I think we've just got to tell it as it is. This is a bad situation, but this solution can deal with it. So, we've got one more question here. Richard, your national planning proposals, they risk surely trampling on local communities. What does that actually mean? Can you expand on this expression, local compensation? Well, yes, I can. That means, for example, if there's a shale gas pad within, let's say, 2, 3, 4 miles of your home, then automatically you should receive a significant discount on your energy bills for the duration of that pad. Likewise, if you live near somewhere where there's going to be a small modular nuclear reactor within a few miles, again, you would qualify for automatic compensation for the lifetime of that generating plant. because clearly there's disruption during the construction process. And that is the right and fair thing to do. And I think as a nation, we've been very bad at putting forward those sort of bold, comprehensive solutions for local communities who may be concerned about something. So that's what I'm talking about. And of course, that's for discussion about the distance, the radius, the quantum. But that's what I'm talking about with local compensation. And I think that's a fair way of dealing with it, but we're in a crisis of supply. The idea that in 2022, the fifth largest economy in the world, a nation like the United Kingdom, as developed as we are, as technologically advanced as we are, that we face rationing and blackouts is just completely unacceptable. We've got to deal with permanently this crisis of supply. So I hope that helps. I hope that answers those questions. And I think that is the end of the question. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for listening, for watching. I'll take any questions later on. I'll be on various media channels. I really do appreciate this and your thoughts. This is a very serious situation. It requires a big, bold, radical solution on both supply and price. And that's what we at Reform UK have put forward. Thank you very much.